each of these themselves can be unpacked in many different ways. To see their confluence will be that much more challenging, but also that much more engaging, I think. So the first part, which I will share, will be a very quick recce of what these things mean.
Mohan?
Is my screen? Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I think Suman would like to introduce you first, and then we can
Okay.
Yeah?
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll not make it very formal, as you said. Let it be very informal. So anyway, good evening and welcome. This is the fourth guest lecture in the ongoing architectural design studio of 7th semester RVCA. So in this semester, we are exploring and investigating various aspects of sustainability and climatic changes. So on this pretext today, we have architect Mohan S Rao among us to take us through his vibrant practice in this domain. And especially I feel very happy to talk about architect Mohan Rao, as my understanding about land and landscape started through his mentorship in school way back in 1997. And those memories have kept our relationship moving for almost few decades now, and that's wonderful. So architect Mohan S Rao heads the multidisciplinary team at Integrated Design, INDÉ, research-based practice engaged in environmental design, regional planning, and landscape architecture with a strong focus on sustainable practices. His interests include traditional knowledge systems and their application to address contemporary development challenges. He is the recipient of several awards instituted by UNESCO, IFLA, HARTCO, amongst many others. Architect Mohan Rao, through his practice, has been decoding vernacular wisdom, restoring heritage landscape, rejuvenating Mother Earth, presenting futuristic visions for the cities, recognizing ecosystems as a tool for urbanism, revitalizing water body networks, constantly connecting the dots between macro and micro, and many more different aspects of design which have generated lots of brilliant seminal thoughts at various levels. So on behalf of 7th Semester Studio and RVCA, sir, I welcome you for this session to take us through your journey. So we will have the presentation first, however you want to take it forward in part. And students can post their questions in the chat box unless you want to raise your hand and ask it. And once the presentation is over, we can pick them up. So thank you very much for sharing your time, sir. Over to you.
Thank you, Suman. Is the screen visible for everyone?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So the first part is what I mentioned, which would be like an overarching framework, which we will try to look at all the three aspects of climate change, vernacular, and the sustainable, but mostly focusing on the vernacular as the starting point for unpacking the ideas of climate change and sustainability. So when we actually go in the exploration of the vernacular, for me, the starting point is the traditional knowledge systems that our country is extremely rich in, and there are many ways to understand this this repository of knowledge systems. What we are seeing here is actually an excerpt from Kalidasa's Meghaduta, and if you were to actually read it, it is the finest expression understanding the geomorphology of the country, at least the geography that it traverses. Understanding river systems to forests to land and the people that inhabit these landscapes. So traditional knowledge systems are normally seen as scientific frameworks that one can draw upon. But for me, whether it is literature, art, poetry, all these actually come together to understand environment as it is seen by different people at different points in time, which actually then creates the canvas for what we loosely call culture. And in what is apparent in all these cases is the idea of the environment as the primary agent that shapes and structures, whether it is lives, livelihood, art, culinary aspects, every single thing that we denote as culture, including, of course, built form and architecture. Every one of these things is embedded in the idea of environment. And it's actually interesting to unpack what the aspect of environment as understood by traditional cultures, specifically in the Indian culture. One could think of them as Prakriti and Purusha. Prakriti is what is and what has always been, loosely called nature. And the Purusha is what is imposed upon it or interpreted and used by man in different ways. So the Purusha could at one level be understood as the built, but also every single system that we impose on the land, be it tanks and wells for water or the agriculture patterns that happen on the landscape. No, it's also very interesting to understand how environment itself has been defined in very different ways. A simple thing like if I were to use the term forest, maybe if we were to use the English lexicon, I may have 3, 4, 5 terminologies, from deep jungles and rainforest to scrubland. Whereas in traditional literature, we have many, many understandings of forest based on the human interaction with that element itself. And this, of course, extends to interpreting and articulating the idea of the environment on to our built and the more tangible aspects. There are, in the same traditional knowledge system, there are many that are tangible, which we tend to value more. It could be buildings, it could be aqueducts, it could be step wells, but we should remember, as humans have occupied this land or in the Indian subcontinent over 7,000 years, there are many expressions that are found that are embedded within the landscape itself, which are not always tangible, not always apparent, but equally valuable as knowledge systems. And it also extends to our current day understanding of which of these we value more. And this has huge implications on what we choose to learn from and what we choose not to. The two images that we can see are both very productive landscapes, but by training, we tend to recognize the image on the left as productive and lush, and the one on the right as degraded and wasted lands. And this really has huge implications on what aspects of this land and landscape that we choose to learn from. So if we were to look at all of this, one could use the slightly poetic term, the literature of the land, which essentially talks about all the systems, the Prakriti and the Purusha, the natural and the human, and how they have interacted and co-produced these landscapes. From very, very basic ideas of sustenance to looking at it really as a dynamic living creature, and how we use those understandings in how we inhabit and use the landscape. And of course, given a long history like this, it has very, very deep incursions in the way we relate to the land, whether it is through the idea of spirituality, belief, faith, how each of these elements then get taken in as part of our everyday. It may not be tangible. It could merely be, let's say, the route of a Ratha Yatra, as we can see here from Puri in Jagannatha, which is as valuable as the tangible aspect of the temple itself. And different interpretations, whether from the political or the economic or the cultural, looks at each of these aspects in very, very specific ways. In several cases, it is very, very difficult to actually separate out the ideas of traditional settlements and sacred landscapes, because landscape, by virtue of it being Prakriti itself, is sacred, and how one occupies that land then gives very different meanings to each of these spaces. Of course, from the architectural perspective, for us, the culmination is on the built aspect, which is what the studio, I imagine, will be concentrating on. But one should remember that the built is not the only component that has derived out of this, neither is it the culmination of these knowledge systems. It's possibly the most tangible, especially from our professional perspective, but each of these embody many, many layers of knowledge systems, whether it be economic, infrastructural, recreational, nutritional, or cultural. So one of the dangers when we talk about the vernacular is that there is a tendency to either romanticize it as it being perfect, or to ignore it, to say that it is completely unscientific. So neither of which, of course, helps us in our conversation. It's important to understand the context that each of these developed in. And the main idea is, how do we then use this knowledge to address current day challenges? It's the two are not independent. The understanding of the vernacular or the past in all its complexities, if only, it is only valuable when you're actually able to contextualize it to address current day issues. There are also many, many frameworks that are developed from very different perspectives that looks at sustainable development, from whether it is the SDGs or before that the millennial development goals, or the current conversations on climate change being anthropocentric. But more importantly, it's not only the definition of the problem, it is also the approach that one wants to take in addressing these. Given the primacy of the built, since it is tangible, it consumes the most energy and it occupies our mind space the most, buildings themselves have been subject to a lot of these frameworks. And we have many, many frameworks. And what's important is that the benchmarks and goals and guidelines that we use in the buildings, rather than being seen as principles, can also pose the danger of being reduced to a numbers game. And the numbers game, as we know, is, like all students will definitely complain about, ultimately becoming a scorecard. If we only recognize the fact that they are completely interrelated and addresses cultural and social together with the built, only then can we use the past traditions to address current day challenges. If one were to dissociate the built from the land and the landscape that it is born from, it can actually be counterproductive, because we fall into the danger of objectifying these expressions. And when we actually reproduce those expressions, they will have very little meaning other than being a beautiful object. And the reason I say this is that on the left, what you see is the image of the classical understanding of climates of the country. Right from 5th standard geography, we keep reading it, including in present day frameworks of whether it is Griha or LEED or any of these spaces. They use these frameworks, which actually divides the entire country into 5 or 6 climatic zones. Whereas the reality is that depending on the lens that we use, it could literally translate into dozens, if not hundreds, of bio-geo regions. And if this understanding is absent when we are understanding either the issues of sustainability or of the vernacular, we will have a very, very limited understanding of either. Also important is to understand the issue of scale, because as architects, one is of course looking at the built form and what we can design and what we can articulate. But each of these built forms are rooted in a larger region, the city region, if you want to call it. And the idea of the city region as understood by the biogeo regions actually have a huge influence on how we articulate the built. Understanding scales of the geography as well as the pace of change is actually very, very important, because especially when one looks at history, we almost think it is something that is frozen in time, not realizing that each of the objects, whether we are looking at a building system or a landscape system, would have taken hundreds, if not thousands of years to transform. And this will have an implication on how we appreciate the issues not being taken in by merely the objects that are very apparent, but also the processes that shaped these changes. So many times when we look at the historic settlements, the architecture, of course, is what is very, very dominant. But I would like to, in the second and the third part of the presentation, I will try to unpack the idea of the land and landscape as being critical in understanding history. From linking the idea of sustainability, especially in the context of climate change, there are many conversations. Of course, greenhouse gases, carbon sequestration being some of them. What is also important to understand is that it can be quite limiting if we were to look at each of these as an independent entity. For example, to make a design very efficient in terms of energy or the amount of water that is consumed, while definitely better than doing nothing, will not give us the same holistic approach to solving issues. What some of you may find useful if you're interested in the idea of sustainability is to explore the idea of planetary thresholds. So while carbon is the most well-known, there are many, many other aspects which are equally critical in how we deal with land and land systems. And if I were to take all of these together, what kind of decision making should we be doing? Will it be numbers driven, where I will give marks to each parameter? Or can we look at factors and consequences? You don't have to read everything that is here on the slide, but essentially what it says is that every action that we choose, whether it is for a building or a certain expression on the land, will have a severe impact on biotic, abiotic, as well as cultural aspects of that particular space and time. And it will actually be quite instructive if one were to look at multiple lenses for every single decision that we take. And equally important, bringing together the ideas of these three, the three critical things that we are talking about. If I were to see one common thread that would tie them together for us in the current day and the futures that we want to create, is the idea of resilience and vulnerability. There are great vulnerabilities, sometimes natural, but sometimes also based on social, cultural, and economic aspects. And how does one link the environmental aspects to the needs of the community based on its vulnerability actually can then help us resolve the solution better than merely looking at it as a technical solution. And of course, I keep talking about the intangible more and more, only because I find this very undervalued in our ways of thinking and exploration. Because in this case, even if all these gods sculpted in stone did not exist, the space would still be sacred by the mere act of the presence of a particular kind of a tree or its position relative to the larger settlement. So I am going to switch. This was meant as a larger framework that tries to bring together these concepts. If anybody wants to respond or raise a question, we can do it now, or I can move on to the next presentation.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, sir. My name is Kaushik. I had a question about one of the slides that you just showed us. It was called the land compatibility matrix.
Okay, let me open that back. Yeah.
In that, it said maximum compatibility and not relevant or incompatible. What does maximum compatibility mean?
Okay, so let's take an aspect of where we can see land use, for example, on the extreme left, sees a lot of maximum compatibility. You can see the cursor where it is moving.
Sir, your screen isn't visible.
Mohan, the slide is not visible.
Okay. Is it visible now?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So just to answer your question, this is a matrix that is developed to understand when we talk of land compatibility, what are those actions on the land that we can impose on it, and how compatible is it to what is called the natural capacity of a particular piece of land. Now, this is not a generic matrix you're seeing. This was for a particular project in a particular context. So, for example, if I were to look at something that is maximum, which is on the bottom left that we see agriculture, plantation, woodlands, and so on. Those interventions have the maximum compatibility with the climate and the physiography of the place, right? Whereas if I were to take, let's say, the top section, which talks about the energy systems, solar, wind, biogas energy, it has little or no consequence, for example, on the geology or the soil of a particular place, right?
Okay.
So when we are talking of compatibility, just to make it clear, we don't have to use these particular ones that you see on the screen. Like I mentioned, this is for a particular project that it was done. If I were to give the same example, let's say you're talking about creating a public space in a particular town, which is what the studio is going to be talking about. The same matrix can talk about, for example, from the cultural perspective. Every intervention that we talk about, how relevant or not relevant is it to that particular place? There may be systems, for example, energy systems, which are completely external to a site, may have very little relevance. But whereas a material expression that you may want, or a response to the cultural needs, should I make it into a skating park or should I make it into a Dasara Maidan? You know, both are public spaces, but which will be most compatible from the cultural perspective? So this particular one, though we are talking about the environment, a similar kind of a compatibility matrix can be developed for any number of criteria.
Okay, so it's a maximum or minimum alteration required sort of thing. The circle.
Exactly. And it will also tell us the relative importance of the intervention that we propose.
Okay.
Because external factors, because we are looking at a very small intervention.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Should I move on to the next presentation?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, because the first one we looked at a lot of very different issues. Now I would like to present two cases where we can unpack all the issues that we talked about. One case study will be based on the non-built aspects of a site, and another one will be on the built aspects of a site. Is the screen visible?
Not yet.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So one case study that we are talking about is the case of Hampi, the erstwhile metropolitan area of Vijayanagara. I hope many of you have seen Hampi. Have you been? How many of you have been there approximately? Is everyone familiar with the space?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now, Hampi, of course, can be read from many, many different lenses. And, you know, the architecture, of course, is astounding. It's been well documented, whether it is the temple, the bazaars, the royal complex, the sheer power of the landscape itself in terms of how dramatic it is, the constructed systems, whether it is for fortification or water, the embedded mythologies, the high form of art, these are all very, very well understood and documented. And as students of architecture, this is what we see and we look for when we go to the place. Now, what is also interesting for me personally was the fact that if you looked at archaeological and archival evidence, the river Tungabhadra itself is not something that is engaged with by the city, which means there are no continuous ghats, there are no bathing or washing ghats, there are no aqueducts that draw the water directly from the river into the city, which belies our imagination of what constitutes a river and a city together. What could also be seen is that since it was a very large metropolitan area, it covered about 140 square kilometers. It had more than 600,000 people, making it the largest and the densest city in the world. It was one of the top 3 cities of its time. I think the first one was Beijing, second one was Hampi. It is bigger than London or Lisbon or any of the larger medieval capitals of its times. But strangely enough, like I mentioned, that if we were to actually look at the Tungabhadra that flows through, the urban agglomerations actually do not hug the river. They actually get situated in places that is away from the river, as we can see in this image. In this image, we can see that the river is there, but the actual urban agglomeration is happening here. So what was built was very specific to the land and the landscape. Each of these were decentralized puras, Krishnapura, Vittalapura, Achyutapura, and so on, which together form the larger metropolitan area. Now, equally important is the fact that agriculture was very much part of the metropolitan experience. So the many myths that this capital city destroys from our current day thinking of cities is that, one, it is decentralized completely in the landscape. Second is that it is pretty much self-contained in terms of resource management, which means they're not all using one source of water, which is the river. And the third and the most important is that it demolishes the binary that we normally understand of urban and rural, where urban is seen as city-centric, arts, commerce, everything else, and the rural is seen as the food-producing area. Now, what can also be seen, this is if we actually understand the growth of the city through the centuries. And like I mentioned earlier, they are actually independent of the river Tungabhadra and sitting in very carefully managed landscapes. So essentially what it did, if I were to put all the layers together, is that the land capacity, which I was referring to earlier when we discussed the matrix, is what determines where urbanization happens and how the land is used. The most fertile land, the lands with the most, let's say, the thickest soil available and so on, was dedicated for agriculture. The least useful part of the land, which meant that it was barren, it had difficult access to water, no soil thickness, was what was urbanized, which is actually the reverse of how we think and work in current day planning. So I was talking about the idea of decentralization as well as how it sits within the landscape. Now, these are the various puras. These, we are only seeing 5 of the total 11 puras that constituted the whole metropolitan area. One, we see that they are disaggregated, that there is no one centrality to the city. Each pura has its own central defining element, which happens to be the presiding deity's temple. There is the bazaar street that defines the nature and activity of the pura, whether it was dedicated to trading in grains or precious stones or textiles or so on. And the urbanization was very much limited to this region in each case. What we are seeing with the blue lines is actually the micro watersheds that this is, of course, we are doing it post facto. We are doing it after the city is built as an analysis. But this is probably the embedded knowledge that led the builders of these cities to arrive at this kind of a solution. So each of the watersheds then defined by the slopes and the topography of the surrounding areas. So the higher ground, which is the yellow, is never built upon. The lowest ground, which is the browns, is what we see as built upon. Because the higher ground, if I were to go back to see the water, is what catches and produces water from the rainfall. In all these images, you can see, for your reference, the river Tungabhadra is actually flowing there. If we were to think of a conventional river-based civilization, the city would actually be a ribbon along this river. So this kind of an interpretation helped us understand the original rationale of why the city was built the way it was built. And as an experiment to kind of test a hypothesis, one of them was taken forward. If you're familiar with the Vithala temple and the bazaar, which is the most famous in Hampi, the idea was to test out the hypothesis of the all the aspects that we talked about: decentralization, resource closure, water security, and so on. In fact, it's very interesting to see that this part of the city actually turns its back on the river Tungabhadra here. Other than the idea of a sacred landscape, which is what created the city in the first place, the river is not seen as an infrastructural element. Very, very different from how we see rivers in our present day context. So if in principle, every city that we looked at, the puras that we looked at, essentially sits between the hillocks, which was the high ground, and on the city urban fabric sitting on the middle low ground. So what essentially this does is that each of the hillsides, the pale yellow ones that you remember from the earlier maps, actually becomes a field for producing water, which means that every drop of rain that is falling on the hill is managed through very different techniques, sometimes through percolation, sometimes through channelization. As we can see the images, corresponding images in the lower area, to ensure that there is year-round water security for each of these spaces. Now, you should also remember that this is not a very heavy rain-fed area. It's probably in the range of 600 to 700 millimeters, which makes it a semi-arid zone. But even within that zone, an entire city could be fed through both food production and for drinking water purposes only through passive management of the land. So, quick look at the actual process of restoration. We do find gold coins while digging. I'm only showing this as a picture. I don't own these gold coins. But essentially what happens is that you rejuvenate the erstwhile structure. This is one of the largest water structures, the Pushkarani of Vitlapura. And if we were merely looking at it from the built fabric perspective, we would have stopped here because we have put back the tank to its original position. But given this understanding of how the system works and interventions in these hilly areas meant that over a period of time, about a year later, you started seeing a small amount of water collecting, because also you should remember these are not channelized engineered water systems. They're actually collected right across the hillside and allowed to percolate. So this year's rainfall will give us next year's drinking water. And in about a year's time, it is completely rejuvenated. You will also notice the dramatic difference in the color of the hillsides. Restoration also meant that the hillsides get naturally green. These are not planted, these are not landscaped. This is the natural biodiversity of the region. So this learning from a place like this can actually help address many of the current day challenges that we look at. How do we provision cities? How do we ensure sustainable ways of provisioning that includes access to water, quality of water, ensuring that no population is vulnerable to including parameters like climate change, because you're not relying on one single source that comes from afar. Like Bangalore depends on the health of the Kaveri 100 kilometers away. Instead, if one were to start looking at decentralized networks based on the land capacity, one can actually ensure a much more resilient system at any scale, whether at the city scale or at a single house dwelling scale. Before I move on to the next one, are there any questions here?
Hello, sir. Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, sir. Your talk is very interesting. My name is
Thanks.
Anjali, and I had a question. You spoke about embedded knowledge, and it's evident from your presentation that the people who built like cities like Hampi, they were very sensitive to multiple issues, and the solutions were often quite simple. And now they seem very counterintuitive. Uh, like the whole settling not along the river but away from the river, it's very counterintuitive. It almost seems to me like there has been a shift in the way people think. I felt like my question was, do you agree with that? And if you do, how does one develop that method of thinking so that we can gain back that embedded knowledge?
Yeah, this is actually the crux of every conversation that we have when we talk about traditional systems of any nature. And one, I think there are many problems. One cannot simply say this is the one single issue that has caused it. One can blame colonization, one can blame economics and many other things. But I think what we are all equally guilty of is the attempt at homogenization. When we say homogenization, that we all aspire to the same standard of living, using the same products, creating the same spaces. So many of the benchmarks that we draw are also completely alien. And these benchmarks are supposed to be global. It's a little foolish to think that I can have the same 135 liters of water given to somebody living in the Sahara and Alaska and the Himalayas, because none of them are responsive to geographies. And to flatten the entire globe to say we will have one standard way of building or thinking actually devalues much of what we have in the past. So the second very important aspect is that I mentioned this danger of over romanticizing our own past. And this is true of every culture. This is not to say the glory of India or the glory of Vijayanagara or anything. Every single culture in every single geography has this embedded knowledge, because there's no way humans could have occupied and thrived for over 10,000 years if they were constantly fighting nature, right? Now, somewhere in the last 200 years of industrial rational thinking, we have done one major shift, and this is my reading, others may think differently, is that while science and engineering are very, very valuable, they can only be productive if they are reinforcing nature. Even the learnings that we saw from Hampi, they were not reinventing science. They were using systems in a way that reinforced natural cycles. Whereas in the last 200 years, especially in the last 50 years, what we are continuously doing is to use engineering and technology to replace nature, not realizing that nature or environment, whatever terminology that we use, is actually the bedrock on which our survival depends. So I think homogenization, this complete reliance on science and technology to replace nature rather than reinforce it. And the third, which I think is the most important in my mind, is the pace of working. Only if I had spent maybe 2, 3, 4 generations understanding a particular land, would I have the capacity to understand its essential nature and work with it. Whereas all of us are party to this. We get a site and within 3 days, we have a very nicely formed structure that comes out of nowhere. In maybe 9 months, somebody will build it without taking a pause to understand what would be the implication of such an action. Now, whether it is a house or the Sabarmati river front or the Three Gorges Dam, we have lost that inherent capacity for patience. And I mean, even if I pose you a problem in class and I will say, okay, tomorrow morning I want to see something, and that's seen as a virtue. The faster I work, the better it will be. But it does not give us the advantage that a patient understanding of a certain system would have otherwise given. Sorry, long answer to a very small question.
Good evening, Mohan sir and Srilata. I have a question. I don't know if you can recollect my past with you. I have been your student in the past.
Yes, yes, I remember.
Now, taking back, you were talking about something from the past which we have not been using right now. And we keep seeing these headlines that, you know, we're going to have water scarcity in the next 20 years, 30 years and all that. Is there something that which can be done in the present scenario, which you at each level, you know, individual level as architects, that we can, you know, impart a message maybe to the coming to the whatever is coming next?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I tend to be very negative because I have just seen too much damage to everything that we should be valuing. But this is not a lost case. This is not that this is very hopeless. There is lots of positivity from each of these systems. If I were to go and approach the city authorities and say, I want to recreate Hampi, it will be seen as a joke. And it will obviously be wrong for me to recreate the past because it will not address all the challenges of the present. But the essential principles that we talked about, of decentralization, of understanding resilience, still very much remains central to all the conversations. So the same learning, for example, where has been taken forward to look at the Bangalore metropolitan area planning with the idea of decentralization and watershed-based planning, is one positive outcome of such a study. So one need not link the historicity directly to its application, but there could be many different kinds of learnings that come from the past, which can still be implemented. You could still use very, very modern day tools, be it GIS, be it any other kind of high technology tools that we use. As long as we remember that those are only tools, they cannot be the decision makers. They can only help you guide in the right way, as long as we know the principles that we are working with.
Just an extension to the question, but now we see each parcel of land as an individual parcel. So it sort of becomes isolated and it's not cohesive.
Correct.
So how do we, you know, how do we negate that?
You see, yeah, there are larger things that possibly we can't change or fight in a very short term. Fragmentation of land is a very, very good example. We are fragmenting land not just as properties, but from the landscape systems that run through this whole thing. But as long as we understand that there is such a larger system, every time I'm looking at an intervention, let's say in a 1 acre site, I don't necessarily draw the boundary of the site and limit myself to that. My design may be limited within that. But our recognition of the larger forces, be it water, be it microclimate, be it pollination by bees, it could be any such thing. Recognizing those things will definitely inform the kind of design interventions and articulations that we will take up.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Should I move on to the last presentation?
Okay.
Mohan sir, can you hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead.
This is a quick, slightly boring question, almost but a bit more practical one, I think. That image you had of a couple of slides back of these little retention ponds in Hampi that were used to collect the water next to the colonnade. Now, the practical point that springs to mind is that what would be the implications of that in terms of, say, those areas becoming breeding grounds for diseases and mosquitoes and so on?
Yeah.
Because I noticed that it's very close to the bazaars as well. So you can imagine that in a rainy scenario. And this kind of ties in with your point about how we tend to overuse technology. So if you're not going to use, say, something like RCC pipes or that kind of infrastructure, how do you manage the pestilential side of this? I mean, again, relevant in a pandemic.
Yes. This is really an important question, and this is very crucial to understand that while I may understand the way, say, percolation systems worked in Hampi, to say that I will apply the same system as is if I'm working in Bangalore would be very, very wrong. So absolutely, you're right that, these, if I were to make them happen in the current day urban situation, these would actually be breeding grounds for all kinds of disease vectors. But specifically in the case of Hampi, if you were to notice that it is not just a detention pond or a small constructed pool which is within the urban fabric, the larger ecosystem is still intact, which means whether it is the insect and bird cycles and those things, if they're remaining intact, then there is no danger of any kind of disease vectors coming in.
Right. Understood. So you're saying that it has to be a part of a larger environmental system which has its own balances rather than a
absolutely
disconnected one. Thank you.
Correct. Absolutely. I mean, we can see many good examples of this in, let's say, many constructed wetlands that are becoming increasingly popular in many cities. So it's not just a water holding area, but a complete ecology that is recognized.
Thank you.
Hi, sir. Another sort of boring question. The information that you were able to access about the watersheds and the retention ponds and the hills and how it moved down, where exactly do we access such information? If we were to do the same sort of study for our own sites?
Yes. Okay, so the final maps that we showed looked very cool and technological, but they're not as simple as that. It has, of course, a lot of hard work. Not every data that we require is easily available. Sometimes, of course, with the present day technology, we have lots of access. It could be a global mapper. It could be many of these interpretations of land that you can do. But they are not all driven by just the tools or the data, because the kinds of data that you require are also very different. In the case of Hampi, it was not just the physical or the topographical. It included archival research, reading up contemporary accounts, poetry, and many, many other sources that actually comes together to build a proper picture.
Okay. Okay, that does sound quite. I also noticed that the landscape has a lot of these loose rocks. So when you rely on something like satellite tech, you can't really, there's the question of accuracy because of all these loose parts that can.
Correct, absolutely. So I wouldn't be so much concerned about the absolute accuracy of the data sets as much as it's bringing together as many layers as possible.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Should we move on to the next one?
Yeah.
Yes, Mohan. Yes.
Yeah. Is the screen visible?
Yeah.
Okay. So this, like we were looking at the intervention of the non-built in the case of Hampi. This is another extreme case. Okay, there are two contrasts. One is that Hampi is devoid of human settlements as we speak. So one could actually imagine and intervene in the landscape in many different scales. But most of our landscape, the countries, the cities, the villages are living cultural sites. So the example that we're looking at is an intervention for low-income housing. In fact, an in situ resettlement of informal settlement in the city of Puri in Orissa. Those of you who may not be familiar with it, other than it being one of the Char Dhams and important for the pilgrimage, it has one of the longest recorded histories of habitation. The first evidence is coming from over 2000 years ago. And what is very interesting for us to see is that every single aspect that happens in the city actually has a direct correlation to the religious cultural frameworks that runs this region. And what the image that we're actually seeing is the Tulsi Katte that every house has. And more than just being a pot to hold a Tulsi, you will notice that every one of them also has a little sari tied to it. So the Tulsi is actually seen as a daughter of the house. So she is decorated in particular ways by every family. I'm going to go through a lot of these random images simply to say that the many diverse layers that actually forms the built fabric are all very, very important when we actually need to look at any kind of intervention. It could be the art, the particular ways Jagannatha is produced by each house. Of course, the materiality of it, and not just the materiality, it's also about the spaces. Where does the private and the public meet? What are the different expressions of these interactions? What forms the idea of a public space? The public, as we imagine, may not necessarily be a playground or a mall or something else. It could be as simple as a sacred tree, which kind of starts holding the whole settlement together. Each of these expressions become very important before even trying to look at what kind of resettlement, what kind of livelihoods happen within these areas. Livelihoods not necessarily just formal, like the shop that we see here, could be the shifting livelihood that happens at different times of the day, at different times of the year in each of these households. Now, this kind of an understanding of the very specificities of the built and their relation to the larger environment, be it the Sarovar and the Pushkarinis, the daily rituals that happen there, each of them starts informing the framework that actually will then help articulate the resettlement process, because otherwise the danger is that resettlement will be seen merely as creating housing or shelter without completely addressing the cultural, social, and economic needs of the people. Not just the cultural, the infrastructural and nutritional challenges that these informal settlements address. Every single house has, for example, enough vegetables or spices to make sure you don't go hungry. You will also notice that even the smallest of the house shacks has these cement bags with lots of different things growing. I mean, in current day, we can give this very fancy terms like urban agriculture. But this is how settlements live and have lived for generations. So getting not the more obvious cultural infrastructural bit, but also the embedded art. Utkala, the traditional name of this region, means a high form of art. So art is extremely important to these people, irrespective of their social, economic, and other status. Now, within this context of understanding the housing typology was to also understand what drives the larger city. And there are many paths, many routes of pilgrimage, many sacred landscapes that actually defines the larger city. So taking all those into consideration, both at the city region level, as well as at the micro level, the frameworks that one would develop will start informing every aspect of the development, starting from shelter to livelihood to the social, cultural, and spiritual needs. I'm going to skip through some of the boring numbers that are absolutely essential in a project like this, simply to tell us how much to build, what to build, how to make it financially sustainable. These are things that I don't want to bore you with because you will all deal with this once you enter any practice. But going back to the crux of this, the many things that we learned was that it is not just the dwelling unit, but its expressions, its interaction, the threshold between the public and the private, the need for livelihood, the integration of elements, all led to a very hybridized kind of a solution where in principle, every single household has access to a street at different levels. You don't necessarily have to be at the ground level to have a street. Even the upper levels have continuous streets. This is very critical from both the social and the livelihood aspects. Every single unit needs to have access to an outdoor space. Outdoors, not necessarily limited to recreational, but very critical for livelihood, which meant that even though it was a very limited box-like site, you actually reimagined the relationship of the dwelling units with the outside. The design is not so important of what is being done for the inside as to how it is sharing street and common spaces at every level. So the final expressions, and this is something that is co-produced with the stakeholders. This is not a top-down design that is just dumped on the people, but you would know every family that has to live here, you know, the 380 families, the livelihoods that they depend upon, the house they are going to occupy in the future, and then to get the complete buy-in from their side for the design to be complete. I will stop here. Okay, questions?
That was a wonderful presentation, sir. Thank you for that. It's very, very insightful.
Pleasure. Okay, Salila told the people are very shy and they don't ask questions, but obviously she's very wrong. So I expect lots more questions.
I'm very delighted that they proved me wrong from the get-go. So now, guys, you said, come on, switch on videos and questions, please. Whoever can switch on videos. Thanks, Mohan. That was really beautiful.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Are we allowed to ask questions about projects, other projects that you've done?
Yes, please go ahead. I don't do any projects for the mafia, so I have no secrets.
Okay. So I had a question about, actually, I'm not really sure what your degree of involvement was with Kumaran School, but you did uh, you did also contribute to the building of that school, and it's currently in a sort of peri-urban location. What are your views on building in peri-urban areas, somewhere where I think where the school is, there's also interactions between a pre-existing rural, there's forest land, and there's the urban population that keeps coming in and out. What sort of pointers do we take from land like that?
This is quite a complex question because there are externalities that are beyond our control. Obviously, if I had a choice of telling the clients where to choose a site, our degree of involvement would be very different. However, for whatever legal, planning, financial, and other factors people would choose a site, one would definitely need to be sensitive of the context. Like I was saying earlier, it really doesn't do us much credit when we draw a very strong line around our sites to say my design is limited to this.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
So in the case of Kumarans, for example, one had to be very cognizant of the fact that it contributes immensely to the watershed of the downstream lake, or it is actually a very critical ecological corridor for migratory birds and other fauna. So the way one would intervene in that in terms of, let's say, conceptualizing open spaces or the vegetation or even the kind of building that needs to come there has huge implications because it is going to impact many of these externalities. Though it is not under our control of where the site came, we are still very much in control of how much of an impact do I have on the larger surrounding.
So the thing is, somehow, if we did build in, like you demonstrated between like the three projects, we sort of see that as we sort of got into the city center, there is still a lot of these externalities that we have to respond to and try not to alter while we're building. So, I mean, is there really a better choice between building in a city center and moving away from it?
Well, as a urbanist, one can definitely say that densifying cities is definitely the better option because it gives you lots of greater efficiencies, not only efficiencies in numbers term of infrastructure or other things, also in terms of access, in terms of equity, in terms of creating a less divided society. Definitely that is the better option. However, given the way the land markets work, the larger planning systems work and things, these vary tremendously between cities. I mean, one could contrast, say, Bangalore with Mumbai. Not that one is better than the other, but the models of growth and development are vastly different.
Yeah.
Though worldwide there is a recognition that densification of urban centers is much more desirable than creating a sprawl of any nature, whether the sprawl is for industrial or housing or institutional reasons. Because the more land you occupy, that much less production can happen on the land.
Okay. I mean, but the thing is, if we're talking about cities for equity, I mean, how much has that really worked out for us?
Absolutely. We could talk of enough number of things on climate and sustainability. If we don't address equity, we will continue to have extremely unsustainable lives, all of us.
That's, yeah, it's quite a bit to think about.
Good evening, sir. Anshri here. Hello.
Hi. Long
Yeah,
time I
so
haven't seen you.
Yes. I have a small question with respect to a project that I'm working on for my thesis right now. So my thesis is based around the redesign of a railway station located in the city of Bhopal. And so when we're talking about like a railway station which is situated in the right in the middle of the city, so with reference to the project that you spoke about last, regarding like understanding sustainability in terms of culture of a place. So I feel like a railway station also needs to respond to the culture of, say, the city, because it's going to be a landmark. So how, because it's a fairly large thing to do, and how do you sort of define the limits? Because a culture of a city can go on and on and on. So how do you define the limits and say that what would be a culturally responsive thing? So that was question one. And then I have another small question relating to landscape with respect to a station. So,
Go on.
So with yeah. So basically, so again, because a railway station or an airport for that matter would require like a large land. And especially, I think a railway station differs from an airport in this sense that it's located right in the middle of a city. So when you have such a large parcel of land and it's surrounded by urban built, how do you sort of manage like watershed drainage on site, and even planting? Because with respect to railways, the planting used is kind of very different, because they sort of try and keep low maintenance, and they try and keep it a height restriction so that it doesn't interfere with the electric cables overhead and all of that. So yeah, like basically to do with how would a student like me, manage like a large drainage scheme for a large plot of land, which is kind of open and empty, and it's surrounded on all sides by an urban belt. So
yeah, I mean, this is related to the previous discussion we had with Kaushik. It's about how responsible we can be about the interventions we do,
yes,
only to ensure that there are as few negative impacts as we can help, right? We could, within the site, you could be creating a fantastic thing, but if it's negative implications are being felt by someone outside, then the design doesn't really work.
yes.
Now, to address the two questions that you had, the first one of culture, this is a very difficult question because each of us define what culture is very differently.
Yes.
And especially as an outsider, we're all outsiders to every culture that we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
One tends to be very patronizing. There is a, if I can use the term, Instagram image of a culture, right? Every city has one image. I will think of, I don't know, Chaat and Chiuda if I'm thinking of Bhopal. So suddenly that is what constitutes culture for me. So it's very important not to fall into this trap of patronizing or defining culture in specific ways, which is where some understanding of history becomes very useful. Instead of us reinventing that knowledge, if I see how different people have dealt with this over the last 300, 400, 500 years, starting from the Holkars, before that the Scindias, before that the Mauryas, it tends to give us a larger timeline to understand culture, rather than just looking at what is immediate, because we tend to react to what is most tangible and immediate. So this is something that can help understand, is the culture of a place defined by how people relate to open spaces? Do they have a lot of their festivals at nights or in the daytime? It could be many of these things, which actually then tells us, gives us some clue as to how to approach the situation. And The second part, I think, is related very much to the earlier discussion, whatever, whether we look at drainage or vegetation or anything, while of course doing justice to the project on hand, has to ensure that there is as little of negative impact on the outside, because the negative impacts are, the price of these impacts are always paid by the most vulnerable, which is why every railway track is lined by informal settlements. So these are the ones who have absolutely nothing. So if I'm doing something, maybe I may not be able to do a direct intervention on their lives. Maybe trees, you gave an example of trees. Can I, instead of planting a useless tree like Ashoka, can I plant a tamarind tree? Maybe somebody can pluck a few things from it.
Right. Yeah.
Something that adds a little bit of value, cultural, social, infrastructural, whatever way.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good evening, sir. I'm Sanjini. I had a question. So recently I read that IIMB is planning on expanding their campus, and the land that they're looking at is the Bannerghatta side that overlaps with the Elephant Corridor and all of that. So in situations like that where you do have to build, but like in terms of animal territories, it's slightly unpredictable, right? So how does one strike a balance in that case? So like, is a balance even possible?
Okay, simple answer. No, it's not possible. I am aware of this site. I'm aware of the challenges that it brings in. There's not every project can have a win-win situation. If somebody was short-sighted enough to make this into an institutional land, not being aware of the elephant corridor or the criticality of this land to feed the downstream watershed, irrespective of how sensitive the design is to the site, how sustainable it is, how passive it is, the fact that we are actually fragmenting an entire land to an animal like the elephant can have very, very few solutions. It's not like I can make a friendly boundary wall that the animal can pass through, right? You can't train the animal to say, okay, this is a friendly boundary wall, don't trample on my lawn. It doesn't work like that. So humans occupying land that they're not meant to occupy will lead to conflicts, and there are no winners. Whether in Coorg or Kerala, you still have the same man-animal conflict. People continue to pay the price, which is very unfortunate.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Hello, sir. I had another question.
Go ahead.
So this question is regarding cultural context. Like I understand it's extremely important because that's how people relate and that's how people behave around buildings. But cultural context has changed throughout time. So a few semesters back, we had studied a village, and when we spoke to the people, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So when we spoke to the people living in those vernacular houses, which were very unique, and the benefits of those houses were apparent to us, and we understood that. But the people living in those houses wanted city-like houses made of brick and RCC. So in such a situation like that, when you're building for people, how do you deal with their aspirations, but also all of these? It adds another layer of complexity. I wanted to know how you deal with it and how we should.
Yeah, this is a fight we have every day, not just with the people in beautiful houses that they no longer want, but in every aspect of it. Like I was mentioning earlier, it's very easy for us to be patronizing, to say this is culture and this should remain static, because many of our ideas of culture come from a very Western notion of museum driven cultures, right? That's something that you would freeze in time, and that is what is true culture. But you should remember that I mentioned this earlier, that what we live in is a living, dynamic culture. And that culture, while it may have had a certain value in the past, would have or is undergoing tremendous amounts of change, mainly driven by the very good word you used of aspirations. Because I find it completely okay that I can drive in my SUV to that house and take pictures, but I will prevent that person from making a garage if they want to own a car, because I'd say, no, that doesn't belong to this culture, right? So it's not so much about objectifying culture or even freezing the culture in a particular time frame. It's about what are those essential values from that culture which we find worth preserving. It's not just the object itself. Maybe what we actually find fascinating is the fact that the buildings have a low ecological footprint, are very passive and things. But what we have as an example to offer are concrete buildings with air conditioners. There's no in between, right? Maybe if one tried to actually balance this, the idea of progress and aspiration, which is what the people want, and the idea of preserving the essentials of what is valuable in that culture, which is what we want. That's the balance that one needs to look at.
Yes.
Mohan, I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Again, thanks for the wonderful presentation, and all credit to you for all the questions that are coming up. It's really nice and refreshing. So a couple of things. So again, as a lot of our students' work projects are in fairly dense urban kind of situations, contexts, and they're working on 1 acre plots. And this question of the urban heat island keeps coming up as well, right? Because there's so much built all around. And I was wondering if you could shed some light on if any projects that you might have worked on where you've thought about, considered that, I mean, the impact of that. And the other question is about, like, so we have this rainwater harvesting law or I don't know, regulation in Bangalore, which has become mandatory, right? That's what I understand.
Yeah.
So, similarly, are there any landscape regulations that by law people have to follow either Bangalore or any other cities? Because when you can have a master plan and it tells you this is how you go about building, this is where you build, this is where you don't build and all that. Is there something similar for landscape as well?
Okay. Yeah. So starting from the urban heat island, this is actually a very, very critical parameter that we consider in any intervention, because it has multiple repercussions on starting from radiation to evapotranspiration to the materiality of the intervention and so on. So whether it is in the built or in the landscape, I think in both cases, the urban heat island becomes very, very critical. And contrary to what is normally understood, it is not only the heat gain cycle that the framework addresses, it actually addresses multiple issues like air quality, dust in the air, the kind of vegetation that needs to be there to address, let's say, evapotranspiration. So it actually addresses heat and water together. And when you look at heat and water, it's not just the static building materials like paving or building facades, but also the nature of the ground and the quality of the vegetation that comes together. And whether small or large sites, I think this definitely needs to be addressed, and it can be addressed at multiple levels.
Okay.
As far as the rainwater harvesting, I mean, I can rant for the next 2 hours about how this is all wrong. I won't do that. because this essentially looks at just capturing all the water and putting it in a tank underneath my house without recognizing where the water would have flown if I had not captured it and what other purposes this water has. So this becomes part of the numbers game when we look at so much rainwater is falling. It's a family of 5 which requires so much water, hence I build a tank of this size. Many of these solutions, though well-meaning, tends to take the attention away from the larger issues in place. While the mandated norm is already in place for rainwater harvesting, good or bad, and it's there increasingly in many cities, not just for houses or buildings, it includes highways, it includes flyovers and things like that, which can actually be very counterproductive.
Okay.
Your linked question was if there was norms for the landscape. Unfortunately, from the licensing authorities across the country, there are no norms that actually talks about how to intervene in the landscape. Many cities, I can think of Pune, for example, Pimpri-Chinchwad near Pune, and a couple of others, which have brought in enough strictures that addresses, for example, drainage, that looks at how much of the water are you draining from the site, whether it is coming from the rooftop, from rainwater, or from the wastewater. It kind of links to how we manage the land and the landscape. What should be the percentage of area that should necessarily be impervious or pervious to allow for recharging of groundwater. Some cities have a few norms, but including the Green Building Council and Griha have some norms on this, but I think they are quite rudimentary and don't go far enough to address the issue.
Okay. Okay. And would you say, so these are the governmental, this is from the government, right? It's not,
yes.
But at the suggestion of private consultants. So you're saying, so is there enough conversation about it then? Do people keep pushing?
There is, but in a very exclusionary way. I mean, there may be things for a software park or an apartment complex, but it doesn't go far enough to address the challenges of a city.
Thanks.
Is there any other question from anybody?
Are we allowed to ask questions about planning again?
Go ahead. If I can answer them, I'll be happy to.
Okay. Turali Forest, which is right next to our college right now, from what I gather, it's basically fragmented into 6 parts. And the 6th part is basically where our college is, and a lot of residential development right now is basically between Turali Forest and the BM Kaval Reserve Forest, which finally connects to Bannerghatta, and on the other side connects to Savandurka. What exactly was the logic of fragmenting the forest into these many portions?
Okay.
Is there one, or?
Yeah, I like the fact that you asked what is the logic. The fact that there probably is no logic.
Oh.
No, but seriously, many of these things also is a direct outcome of a very numbers-driven understanding of planning. To say, for example, there should be 300 hectares of forest. Now, what these numbers don't recognize is that the the sanctity of the forest and the network is much more than the numbers. If I were to take the same 300 hectares and put them into 300 pockets of 1 hectares spread across the city, vis-a-vis having the 300 hectares as one consolidated stretch as an ecological corridor, the implications are immensely different. However, in the numbers-driven land use planning, that is the norm, these actually don't count as arguments. For the simple fact that somebody will say, oh, but I'm cutting down 100 hectares here to make RV college, I will plant 100 trees somewhere else, is the usual rationale that we get. So recognizing it as a system versus a physical entity are two very, very different things.
So this might not be so different from what's happening in Goa right now.
Absolutely. The foolishness of the Goa one, I mean, like one can go on about it for hours. The latest proposal that I heard is that the Goa government has asked for some land in Karnataka so that they can put compensatory forestation. You might as well plant it in Madagascar, I mean, for all the difference it makes.
Yeah. Oh God. Okay. There's a little knot in your stomach after you hear something like that. I hope the ones getting salaries are happy with the money they get.
I have a question. I'm Disha. So it is on a project where these indigenous communities have been relocated onto the buffer zone of reserved forests. So even if you were to look at it as a positive move and not a negative, how should we address the reconstructing of this buffer zone of the forest such that it creates a dwelling environment for them after rehabilitation or relocation?
Yes, I mean, the first is to understand that, yes, it's not a very desirable situation to remove the communities that have lived in the forest. Yes. However, the fact that they have been moved out due to external forces, we can no longer influence. When we have to create a resettlement program for them, similar to what we were discussing in Puri, for example, is to understand what is the needs that are associated with the housing, because it's not just the shelter that matters, it's a whole way of life. Are these pastoral communities? Do they depend on non-forest produce like collecting honey or something else? They would have a certain cycle of life. How many of those we could actually enable within this resettlement area can actually make a huge difference, rather than just look at the quality of the housing.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, I have a question. It's rather a seeking. So you have talked about compacting the city center to have a better growth in terms of urbanization, and that is a kind of result of homogenization globally. Now, what could be a futuristic thinking process about creating different kind of thresholds between village, towns, and cities? So right now, if we see there is a direct connection between village and to the city. So people who have a larger aspiration, they just come by to the city for opportunities. So hence making it more denser. So what could be kind of possibilities to think about thresholds where people don't have to directly shift from village to city to kind of satisfy their aspirations?
This question is loaded with many politically incorrect answers that I should come up with. But just you use the term thresholds. I think that's a very, very important way to approach this, because if one were to not think of the division between the city and the village or the rural merely in spatial terms, but in functional terms. We talked about food production, for example. Should necessarily all the food production happen in a village and all the industrial and other production happen in a city? Is that the definition we come from? Merely a threshold like understanding the food cycle or waste generation can be an interesting starting point. I mean, I don't know if this is directly related to how you're thinking, but it will be interesting to know that till the invention of piped sanitation system, most large metropolitan areas, including Paris and London, were growing more food than the surrounding countryside, because they were using the waste produced by horses and humans as manure instead of exporting that waste. Just that one single invention actually changed and tipped the balance completely. So more important than the spatial segregation and thresholding, if we were to think of it in functional terms or productivity terms, if I can use the term, I think it can have a very interesting conversation around that.
Because you also showed in a couple of slides the threshold between the streets and the households and how they really use throughout the day and the year. I mean, that's a very unique level thinking about that process, and then how it can be scaled further.
So, yeah, because a lot of our urban theories naturally come from the West, which is where we have learned it from, but it is about time that we questioned some of those and also contextualized them into our own society, because there is this distinct separation between work and home in classical urban planning. But if you actually look at cities, how they have always functioned, that division never existed. So that's one way to understand the threshold between what is personal and what is public.
Mm-hmm. And since you have spoken about unpacking the ways of understanding the vernacular wisdom or the traditional wisdom, so in many investigations or studies or even explorations, we see that we tend to visualize or tend to symbolize certain things as vernacular, but actually which is not or may not be. So how do you distinguish between that? Which is real and which is superficial?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very difficult one because you're actually fighting perceptions. You're not really talking science. So what is truly vernacular is, I mean, I would rely on systems rather than objects. Or if humans have occupied a certain landscape for X number of centuries or millennia, the systems would be much more robust than the physical expression of those, be they houses, be they artifacts, or anything else. And it's actually not very easy to distinguish this because popular perception tells us something else. It's like people's perception of saying planting trees is good. Planting trees is very good, but if I were to plant the trees in the wrong place, maybe if I take over a grassland and make it into a forest, I'm actually causing more harm. But 9 out of 10 people will not be able to talk through this logic to say that how can trees be bad is immediate reaction. I mean, it's the same if I'm looking at a vernacular house with columns and sloping roof, I immediately argue that it is very valuable without understanding whether it is relevant or it is an imposed order.
was in the studio also, we have been seeing that certain areas or certain regions of India, we have a very strong sense of vernacular architecture as such. One of the maps what you had shown also suggested that, not particularly, but where you showed different kind of climatic conditions versus different kind of topographical conditions. So,
Yeah, true.
so when we were looking into little bit detail, we realized that when we talk about Rajasthan or Gujarat region, we see a lot of step well constructions and those kind of vernacularism. But when we talk about Bangalore, we really actually struggling to figure out what real vernacularism Bangalore has, or did it actually have or not.
Correct. This is what I call the Bollywood phenomena, because our minds are full of the most iconic images that we see in movies or on Instagram or whatever. So it really helps if one were to move beyond the objects. Maybe we can look at culinary traditions or linguistic traditions or poetry or the 50 other things that actually constitutes a culture, rather than limiting it to the very physical, the very built.
It's much deeper than it appears to be.
Yes.
I think even though this is a Saturday evening, we spent a great time with you.
And I'm glad I'll be glad if it helps in your studio and the ways of thinking. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
It definitely does, because this semester, again, as you know, we were encouraging our students to, the double challenge was, first of all, they've all picked their own sites, so we don't have a common site for them, and they're picking sites wherever they are based out of, and then each site has its unique questions and challenges, and so I think so it's kind of fun also at the same time, and as Suman says, therefore you question this idea of local, and as you very rightly said, vernacular doesn't have to be in the built. And we've been asking them to look at other cues and other ways of thinking about vernacular. So yeah, I think the students had a fabulous time. They've been writing to me and they said it's been a great talk. So thanks so much again. Yeah.
Welcome. And you can share some of the gossip with me later about bad comments.
There were none so far. So yeah. Any other questions, guys?
I think this we can take it as an ongoing conversation even later on also, not to be limited only for this session. But anyway, if there is no immediate question, probably we can say bye to everyone.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us. It was great. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Good night. Bye, Mohan. Thanks.
Bye.